Okay, so this could be a train wreck, but Bobby's spending the day with his daughter today, and I'm actually going away for a few days. I want to do something with the NFL this weekend, just in case Bobby doesn't get to it. And I'm going to put my own kind of spin on it. Again, I'm not really going to go game by game. I really want to just kind of walk you through how I would think about constructing a, you know, lower owned correlated lineup for the purposes of playing GPPs. So again, we're trying to use my skills in portfolio management, plus lineup construction, plus just being naturally, contrarian. But being naturally contrarian isn't really relevant because you have to force yourself to be contrarian to be, to be in the ball game in these types of things. So let me just walk you through how I will use projections and the way my mind works within those projections to build these kind of lineups. So like for today's slate, for Saturday's slate, the way I kind of start is with who the highest owned player is. So what should be the highest owned player on this Saturday slate is going to be DeAndre Hopkins at wide receiver. Now, again, I always build from the receivers out, and I kind of let the quarterbacks kind of fall into line. Like whichever wide receivers I use, that's what quarterback I end up using rather than building from the quarterback out. So the first player overall that is the highest owned is DeAndre Hopkins, and he's projected to be about 75% owned. So the very first thing that I think about is, can I fade him? Because if I can't, then I have to go on and do other things with my lineups. So what I usually do first is I kind of run an optimal with him in it and see what the top 50 scores are. And then what I'll do is I'll run an optimal without it and see how close those scores are. And in this particular case, I mean, it doesn't matter whose optimizers you use, whose projections you use, it's going to be close. And the lineups without DeAndre Hopkins in it, I mean, are a little bit lower, but only 4 points or so. So, some will argue that that's a decent amount. But when it comes to a 3-game slate winning a GPP, I'm going to be able to live with fading him. But more to the point, what I'm doing is I look through his projections, and what I'm doing is I'm ranking the wide receivers kind of by projections here. And I see that DeAndre Hopkins does, in fact, have the highest projection, but it's only by about a point, okay? As a matter of fact, over Julian Edelman, I mean, it depends on where you look, but the one I'm looking at has Hopkins as only about a point over Julian Edelman. So first of all, he's going to project to be a much higher point per dollar play, Edelman over Hopkins. And in addition to that, he's projected to have only about half the ownership. So, Hopkins at 75% or Edelman at about 35, 37%. To me, it's kind of a no-brainer is where I would start this thing. I mean, I would start this thing with Edelman over Hopkins. So now, again, it's not the greatest thing in the world having a 39% guy. It's not like the guy's completely unowned, but, it's certainly better than the 75% guy. So we can start with this. Now, the next thing I would do is think about what I've just done. So I've eliminated DeAndre Hopkins from the lineup, at least to start with. What would seem to me to be a natural pivot, like one reason why Hopkins would not get these touchdowns, would not get all those points, would be because the targets and the efficiency, I should say, would go elsewhere. And so the natural person you would use instead of Hopkins would be Will Fuller. Now, he is projecting to have, probably third highest amount of fantasy points, and value-wise, he rates to be pretty okay. And again, he's 30% also, so it's not as if he's, it's any great shakes to take a 30% guy. But again, we're fading the 75% guy, so at least we're off to a good start. So you have two receivers here. Now, the first thing that I would do, I mean, it's tough. You either want to immediately go for the correlation with one of these receivers, with another receiver, or you could start putting your quarterback in. But right now, I'm not completely convinced which way I'm going to be stacking. It could be that this Edelman play turns out to be a one-off, or this Fuller play turns out to be a one-off, and the other wide receiver I use might end up being the one I stack my quarterback with. So the first thing I will do, I will look for another wide receiver, and just kind of like looking over here, again, looking at ownership, looking at projections. I see there's a whole bunch of other guys kind of right around Fuller's range at 6K. And I'm looking at them, and they all look to have very similar type ownerships. I'm looking at the guys like, well, we could just sort by salary here, but guys like Rashad Perriman, John Brown, Emmanuel Sanders, you know, all these guys kind of around that Cooper Kupp, all around this kind of range. And I'm looking through all of them, and they all look to have very similar projections, okay? So we're looking at Perryman and Woods. Yeah, we're talking about some differences, but maybe a half point or 1 point. So what I'd love to be able to do is find a guy that projects within that range who's on the lower own side. So when I look through these, and again, if your ownership projections are different, then just go with whatever those are. You know what I mean? This is the process that I'm kind of going through. And one guy that shows up here is John Brown. Okay, John Brown projects to have a very similar output as Cooper Kupp, as Robert Woods, maybe a little less than Rashad Perriman, maybe 2 points or so. But, you know, the way wide receiver results distribute, you know, that's really not that big of a deal. It seems though John Brown, though, is projecting to have about, you know, I won't say half the ownership, but at least a good, he's the lowest owned of all these guys, like Kupp at 20%, Emmanuel Sanders at 20%, Robert Woods 25%, Rashad Perriman at 30%, okay? So of all these guys that are in the same kind of projection range, I can go to John Brown at only 15% and kind of be in good shape as far as overall ownership goes. Because with each decision you make that reduces ownership over someone else, then the product of your ownerships, you know, continue to decrease, you know, relative to the rest of the field, and you're trying to get somewhere. So what you have here, again, you started with these receivers. Is it time to kind of put that quarterback in? So you could, since you have a New England and a Buffalo thing, you know, you could put one of these quarterbacks. You could put John Brown in, Josh Allen in, or you could put in Tom Brady, or you still have not given up, because on the flex position and the tight end position, you could have that second, you could have a bring back from Houston. Like you could decide to go on the Tampa side, one of these tight ends, and that could be your correlation play with Will Fuller. So you don't have to really commit to your quarterback yet. So let me go through these receivers one more time and just make sure before I head to the tight end position that there's nothing that really stands out. So like I'm looking at these, and they're all these 6K guys. They look to project around the same, and there's no real ownership standout. There might be one, which I will get to. So I'm going down to the 5K range, and there are two guys that are projecting to have about 10% ownership. Maybe we'll look at that in a little bit. We'll look at Beasley, Samuel, maybe Justin Watson, Brandon Cooks. We'll get back to those in a minute. But I'm going to go to tight end for a second. I have tight end up on my board right here. And what's interesting about tight end this week is that you could argue that 2 or 3 of the best receivers on the slate are tight ends. And you could argue that George Kittle, as a matter of fact, George Kittle is projecting to have more fantasy points. Is that possible? More fantasy points than DeAndre Hopkins. Like he's projected to be the top receiver overall on the slate, which is why he has 60% projected ownership, right? Can we fade that? Yeah, sure. We could do anything. You know what I mean? It's not like he's 4,000 or something like that. He is 6,500. So at 60% ownership, where you have to put in one tight end, maybe there's another tight end that you could kind of play. So looking through tight ends here, again, you know, you have him up above at 17 points as far as projections go. Then you have kind of two guys that both are projected about the same. Both are about 10 points. But one of them is 4K, and that's O.J. Howard. But the other one, Tyler Higbee at 5K, is projected to have about 13% ownership. So you can choose between O.J. Howard and Higbee to kind of pivot off of somebody like Kittle. Now, the other thing about the tight end position, which is interesting, though, is that Tampa has 2 tight ends that are going to be competing for action. Howard and Cameron Brate. As far as projections go, Cameron Brate is projected to be a little bit less, but he gets that tight end. He gets that touchdown. Then you're going to really be happy that you had him, and you can talk about narratives and that Jameis Winston kind of likes him more than O.J. Howard. How much does that matter? Well, I don't know, but for a 3-game slate at lower ownership, I might take a shot at Cameron Brate at lower ownership at 7%. But I'm kind of torn here between somebody like Higbee and somebody like Brate. So for the purposes of this, both of them being at 10%, let's put in Tyler Higbee right here. Okay? And the reason why is I want to make it a little more difficult, right? So right now, what I have is 4, lower owned guys, right? Higbee is lower owned than the top tight end, and all 3 of these receivers are lower owned than plenty of their counterparts. Now we have correlation between 2 of them. We have Edelman, we have John Brown, and we have Higbee. Edelman and we have John Brown with correlation. So if we want, we could choose to put one of these quarterbacks in, like we could put in Brady, or we could put in Allen. The only other thing we could wait on is that flex position, because if the flex position puts a run back to either Higbee or to maybe or to Fuller, then maybe we use either Watson or Goff. Well, why don't we hold off on that for a second, and let's go to the running back position. The running back position this week looks to be kind of ugly. You have 2 guys. Well, let's not even say there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys all project within 2 points of each other near the top. Between Gurley, Singletary, Mosher, White, and Hyde, all 5 of them are kind of within 2 points of each other. Okay, so you look at ownership. Really don't get any bargain out of any of these guys. You have Gurley, Singletary, Mosher, White. All these guys are over 30%. So it's not like there's one guy that has a big advantage over the other one. I mean, you could go down the list to these other guys like Hyde, Ronald Jones. These guys, they're still like 20%. If you want to get down to the lower owned guys, you're going to have to talk about guys like Sony Michel, who is maybe only 3 points below that tier as far as projections go, at 13%. The problem with Sony Michel is he's not going to kind of fit this build too well, because if we're going to take Sony Michel, then it's not the greatest environment for Edelman. So what you could do with those guys that I mentioned, let's say you wanted to play Gurley. Now he's the highest owned guy. He's at 46%. So if you want to play Gurley, you could put Goff in a stack with Gurley and Higbee. Or if you wanted to, see, if you couldn't really play Singletary, because Singletary doesn't really match that game script too well, right? If you're going to play Edelman and John Brown, having Singletary kind of a grinded out runner, it's not really the greatest correlation as far as this lineup goes. Of the guys that I kind of mentioned, and Mostert also, he's not the guy. The guy who I mentioned that fits this build the best of those guys who are all about 30%, that project about, very similar to one another, is actually going to be James White, right? The idea being is that, you get Edelman and John Brown, you get passing going, then James White is going to kind of be, that passing receiver, that receiving running back that fits that kind of game script, that kind of pace. So if you go this route, now what you could probably do very safely is put in your quarterback, right? Because if you're going to have 2 kind of pass catchers from one team, it's going to be very difficult, at least for me, to put a quarterback in from another team. I know some people do it. Like if you really, really like John Brown, you put, and the quarterback was, this is a really nut matchup. You would put him in and then run it back with 2 guys. But I don't have that much faith in John Brown to warrant having 2 run backs from New England. So what I could do is you could put in Tom Brady, and now you kind of have your construction, right? You kind of have what you're doing. You have your Brady with your two receivers, that being Edelman and James White. You have your run back with John Brown. And then you have a receiving one-off who's, kind of a pivot, sort of lower owned than definitely lower owned than your Hopkins. And you have this tight end, and all you're going to need is a running back, a flex, and a defense. We're about defense in a minute, okay? But what can we do to fill in the rest of this lineup to make this lower owned and continue to be good, well correlated? So far, I'm in. So far, it looks really good. Right now, we only have one guy from what's going to be the highest owned game on the slate, I would think, this Houston-Tampa Bay game. We're fading Hopkins. We're fading, so far, all these Tampa receivers, including the low-owned guys, the low-price guys, and Perryman. And so far, we haven't really taken much from the Rams game. So we do have to fill this in. So where could we go from here? Well, let's go for max correlation here. We're going to have to deal with the second running back position eventually. I kind of want to wait on that one. Let's see if we can get a good receiver in this flex from that kind of pile of options, right? What I'm kind of thinking I'm going to end up doing is using this spot for Gurley, though. We're kind of, I would say, running out of salary. We're running into having too much salary. So I might end up having to do something like Gurley and Higbee in the same lineup. So if I were going to do that, who would be the guy on San Francisco I would run back? Well, there are two ways you could do this. One is you could play either Emmanuel Sanders or Deebo Samuel. The other thing you could do is go double tight end and go George Kittle. Now, the problem with going George Kittle is that you're now, upping your ownership, right? Now you're taking a really high-owned guy, and you got to be careful not to get too high-owned here. So if we did that, then we'd have to kind of get a little more low-owned with the running back, I would imagine. Let's kind of see what both options look like. Let's first look and see what the chalkier running back situation would be with the lower-owned wide receivers. So we're talking about picking either Sanders or Samuel to correlate with Higbee and probably Gurley. So I'm looking at these guys, wide receivers for San Francisco, and from a projection perspective, Sanders looks a little bit better, but not by much. And points per dollar, he looks to be about the same at twice the ownership. So if we threw in Samuel right here, okay, then Samuel as the lower owned guy, and then we put in Gurley over here, that would be one way to go, okay? Then if you want, you could put in Patriots defense, okay? And I wouldn't worry about playing Patriots defense in this build, okay? Because, Brown could certainly catch a touchdown or even two and still have New England catch a pick six or two. So I have no problem doing it that way. So you put Patriots defense in here, and that is one way to do it. Another thing, if that makes you feel uncomfortable, is you could just go ahead and put Sanders in, right? And Sanders makes sense. You could still afford the Patriots. Maybe that's probably the more responsible thing, is to do that. Or the other thing you could do if you wanted is you could go with what I said would be something like putting Kittle in here, okay? And actually, if you put Kittle in here, you could still, if you wanted to, get all the way up to Gurley, and then you just have to do something like, Texans D. And this actually plays pretty decently, because if you're fading all this Tampa Bay stuff, I think the Houston defense is probably kind of a good idea, okay? So it depends on how you want to do it. But remember, if you do play Kittle, now you're playing Kittle and Gurley, who are two pretty high-owned guys. You're still fading Hopkins, which is good, all right? So it's not exactly the uber chalk, but for some reason, I think this is a little bit too chalky. I think I would rather do something like Sanders than go to Kittle, okay? And if you went to Sanders, what you could do, like I said, You could pay up for Patriots defense, or if you wanted to, if you want to be different, you could stick with this game script and say, okay, I'm going to think that I have leverage on all these Tampa receivers because I'm taking the Houston defense. I'll leave 1,000 on the table, right? So I'm not saying you have to do this. And I'm not saying you have to play this lineup, obviously, although I think I might just put this in just for help. But I think this is the way you should be thinking about how to build lineups. Now, again, this is a hand-built lineup, and you could do this 20 times in a row, or you could script this and just put a maximum amount of ownership on here also. But I do think it's important to learn how to hand build and figure out correlations on your own and figure out how to put in low pieces on your own before just trusting the optimizer to do it. Yes, it does save you time, but I do think it is worth the grind work to build lineups by yourself first. So this is just one way to go. But I think that is the way to approach it, is to figure out the chalk, figure out if it's fadeable, and then how to fade it by making correlated lineups with lower ownerships. You don't have to be completely off the board to have a low-owned lineup, just kind of a lower-owned lineup, right, that a lot of people are going to have. All right, that's really all I had. I hope this comes out. I hope that it's worth something to some people. That's really all I have for the Saturday slate for you guys. I will catch up to you probably after the weekend.